Greetings. Welcome back, everyone. We're going to continue with our discussion of the apology. In the previous video, I introduced you to some of the background on the topic at hand, philosophy in general, but more particularly Plato and this dialogue, the apology, which we're kicking things off with. I talked a little bit about the figure of Socrates, who, as you now know, is the main protagonist really of the early dialogues of Plato. And as we came to understand, Socrates is actually at the end of his philosophical career, as it were, as he is on trial for life for all kinds of possible accusations, which we're going to try to sort out a little bit today further. So I would like to dive in a little bit greater detail with you today regarding some of the finer points of the text and try to reach some conclusions about what Socratic wisdom in particular means. I think we'll see that ultimately this is a dialogue about philosophy as a particular kind of life embodied by this main character of Socrates. Okay. So as we know, Socrates begins with, in a way, a justification of his behavior as a philosopher. So the first thing we've come to know is that Socrates is not apologizing really for anything he's done in the traditional sense. He's actually defending his behavior as a thinker, as an independent practitioner of philosophy and critical thinking. Now, there's a lot of controversy over what exactly Socrates is meant to have done wrong, according to the prosecutors Miletus and Anytus. And we'll have to try to see what is really motivating the worry that Socrates perhaps poses some kind of a threat to the city-state of Athens. All right. So I believe, and this is, I think, a good way of interpreting the text, is that Socrates is most of all interested in what it means to live a good life. He has a lot of different views about the nature of reality, the nature of the afterlife, as we'll come to see when we read a dialogue called the Phaedo. But I think really Socrates is above all famous for, as it's sometimes described, bringing philosophy down to earth. So many of the philosophers who came before him, philosophers that are now known as the pre-Socratic philosophers, were deeply metaphysical and deeply speculative people. But they perhaps were a little bit head in the clouds. They did not necessarily think about everyday practical issues like virtue, ethics, and human knowing in the sense that Socrates does. All right, so that's kind of an innovation of Socratic philosophy. And very early on in the dialogue, we come to this idea, or this sort of reputation, I suppose, of Socrates being referred to or known as the wisest person in Athens. So what is this supposed to mean? Is he the smartest person in Athens? Is he the best at argumentation? Does he know more than other people? There's a lot that is packed into this idea of wisdom. And early on, Socrates comes to this kind of somewhat peculiar definition of wisdom, which maybe stood out for you, which is that he is wise or wiser than everyone because he admits he knows nothing. So I want you to think about why this might be something to value, this idea of not knowing. Usually when we think of wisdom or perhaps intelligence, we think it means knowing all kinds of stuff, or at the very least one thing very well. If you're a professor, you're supposed to at least have a specialty. Socrates probably wouldn't do very well today in the modern university because his entire reputation is staked on the idea that he knows nothing. So what exactly is good about not knowing nothing? What is meant by this? Why can he be the wisest person when he admits to know nothing? All right, so in order to unpack this idea a little bit more, there's kind of a recollection of sorts from an earlier time in his life when his friend Chaperon went to this figure of the Oracle of Delphi in ancient Greece, which is an element of ancient Greek mythology. And the oracle was known to give prophecies that were meant to be uh, essentially the word of God. They were meant to be absolutely true. All right. So Chaperon goes to the oracle to, in a sense, hear the verdict on Socrates' wisdom. And, the word of God, if it's coming from Delphi or any other Greek figure at the time, was meant to be absolutely true. It's meant to be true in an unquestionable, unconditioned way. So I want you to think a little bit about what it means to receive divine revelation, i.e., in the form of Socrates being told he's the wisest person, but then kind of having this little bit of skepticism, as we talked about. His approach to philosophy is skeptical, um, in as much as he doesn't really take for granted that this is actually a true statement. So there is a little bit of a difficulty here from Socrates' point of view, because part of the reason he is being accused of corrupting the youth, perhaps in Athens, is that he might be some kind of an atheist, right? I think that's an idea that's in free circulation throughout the piece. So actually, if he is being skeptical about the word of God, it might actually be true that there is something to his atheism, or maybe his disbelief or lack in faith in the gods. So I just want you to hold that in your mind as a question as we work through this component of the piece. So Socrates does this little word of God testing, as it were. And so what he does is he goes out into the agora, into Athens, and he gets into conversations again, as is his habit, with essentially different experts in the city, different professionals who have different ranks. And he tries to see if there's anyone around who's wiser than he is, basically. Is there anyone who knows more than he does? And we come to an interesting thing. I just want to pull up the text here and look at the details so you can mark it for yourself um, in this sort of back and forth. Okay. So how does the encounter go? Um, Socrates runs into um, essentially the most prominent people in ancient Athens, right? And each one of these classes of people he finds are, in some sense, inadequate in terms of their knowledge. All right. And all of them will have a very similar pattern. Okay, so if you just turn with me and look at 26, this is where the kind of testing of his wisdom starts to happen. Plato writes, after that, I proceed systematically. I realized to my sorrow and alarm that I was getting unpopular, but I thought that I must attach the greatest importance to the god's oracle. So I must go to all those who had any reputation for knowledge to examine its meaning. And by the dog, men of Athens, for I must tell you the truth, I experienced something like this. In my investigation in the service of the god, I found that those who had the highest reputation, uh, right, so the most kind of esteemed people, were nearly the most deficient, while those who were thought to be inferior were more knowledgeable. All right, so it's almost as though things are totally upside down. The people who are thought to be the most expert, the smartest, are actually the most efficient, and those who are deemed inferior are much better than assumed. I must give you an account of my journeyings, if they were labors I had undertaken to prove the oracle irrefutable. After the politicians, okay, so he goes to politicians first, I went to the poets, writers of tragedies and dithyrambs, and the others, intending in their case to catch myself, being more ignorant than they. I should just say, as an aside, that the word poetry in this context has a much bigger meaning, encompasses many more things than we mean it in contemporary English. Poetry really means art in general. It's a huge kind of category, poesis, of artistic making. And here he's speaking specifically about the authors of great tragedies, which was a very important aspect of ancient Athenian culture. Tragedies were a place where everyone from the polis, the community, would gather and experience a kind of collective understanding of itself. Okay, so the poets were not marginal figures at all. They were very important figures in this particular time. The writers of tragedies and dithyrambs and the others, intending in their case to catch myself being more ignorant than they. So I took up those poems with which they seemed to have taken most trouble and asked them what they meant, in order that I might at the same time learn something from them. I'm ashamed to tell you the truth, gentlemen, but I must. Almost all the bystanders might have explained the poems better than the authors could. I soon realized that poets do not compose their poems from knowledge, but by some inborn talent and inspiration, like seers and prophets, who also say many fine things, and without any understanding of what they say. The poets seem to have had a similar experience. At the same time, I saw that because of their poetry, they thought themselves very wise men in other respects, which they were not. So there again, I withdrew, thinking that I had the same advantage over them as I had over the politicians. All right, so what's happening here? Socrates is saying that the poets, while geniuses in a way, they are divinely inspired. They have this great creative expression. They actually don't have knowledge of what they're doing. And I think this is actually true if you ever watch interviews with contemporary artists or musicians or painters. Um, they're kind of working from instinct, really. It's not particularly thought out what they're doing, and they have a hard time sometimes explaining uh, what it is that is going into their great work. Um, I think Socrates is right about this, but I'm not sure I agree, and I ask you to think about whether or not you agree that that's a problem. So clearly, Socrates is prioritizing knowledge over creativity. He seems to be giving pride of place, at least here, to knowledge. And the problem with poetic knowing is that it actually doesn't know that much, but it thinks it does. So this is really the pattern that each one of these classes of experts will fall into. They will somehow all not be aware of the limits of their own knowledge, and they will be, in their ignorance of that limit, um, in a way, a little foolhardy or a little bit too arrogant in their own kind of knowledge or wisdom. Okay, so he then goes to craftsmen, and craftsmen here in this context also just means people who can, they're kind of like engineers, basically, anyone who can build, right? So I went to the craftsmen, for I was conscious of knowing practically nothing. And I knew that I would find that they had knowledge of many fine things. All right, so they have knowledge about all kinds of stuff, how to build, houses and furniture, etc. In this, I was not mistaken. They knew things I did not know, and to that extent, they were wiser than I. But men of Athens, the good craftsmen, seemed to me to have the same faults as the poets. Each of them, because of his success at his craft, thought himself very wise uh, in other most important pursuits. And this error of theirs overshadowed the wisdom they had. So that I asked myself, on behalf of the oracle, whether I should prefer to be as I am, with neither their wisdom nor their ignorance, or to have both. The answer I gave myself in the oracle was that it was to my advantage to be as I am. Okay, so what's the contrast Socrates is drawing between himself and the craftsman? The craftsmen do indeed have some knowledge, but it's a very narrow knowledge. It's narrow in the sense that it's specific, it's very technical, it's very refined. But if you ask a craftsman what is the meaning of life or how can they prove God, they're very ignorant. Now, the problem is, and it's okay to have limits to your knowledge, the craftsmen don't know what those limits are. And so Socrates says, actually, it's better to be me, who knows nothing about anything, than to be someone who knows a lot about very little, but thinks they know everything. All right. So it's this point of being in a position of knowing that you know nothing that Socrates will continuously uphold as the standard of rationality and skepticism, because philosophical wisdom has to start from a standpoint that doesn't take things for granted. All right. That is in a standpoint of almost childish curiosity about the nature of things. As we lose that curiosity through knowledge and training and overtraining, we start to get a little bit too arrogant, a little bit too quick to think we know, or to presume that we know, when in fact we might be very wrong. All right, and so Socrates essentially runs this investigation through so many different people in the city and sees that all of them are, in one way or another, falling prey to the same fate. Okay, so the full catalog of people he talks to, just to rehash here and get a little systematic about it, is politicians, poets, craftsmen, and the sophists. This category of people we talked about in the last class. Sophists were rhetoricians and practitioners of argument and speech, and the sophists similarly are very good at having kind of a bag of tricks for emotional speaking and manipulation, really, but actually aren't aware of very much else. Their knowledge is a kind of a superficial knowledge. All right. So, because no one in town seems to be aware of the limits of their knowledge, Socrates is the only one who is. Therefore, he is the wisest person. Indeed, he has proven that the oracle is true. Um, he's not the wisest because he knows more than anyone. It's not as though if you were to peer inside Socrates' brain or something, you would see more facts and data and stuff swirling around in there. It's actually his wisdom comes from a willingness to suspend belief about what people believe to be true. So the skeptical Socratic method um, holds that investigation into the truth of something should begin from not knowing and from an awareness of that not knowing. When we take for granted things in the world and we fall victim to the ideas that are in circulation, what Socrates calls opinion or doxa, that's often the road to philosophical ignorance or philosophical error, right? A lot of the ideas we have about the world have to do with just tradition and custom. That is, what our parents taught us is true, what our church maybe taught us is true, what our schools taught us is true. And as you move through life, you come to recognize that a lot of those ideas are actually really wrong and misguided. Um, but it's actually hard to pry ourselves loose from these prejudices because we're not really in the habit of testing them very often. We're in the habit of living in them comfortably. So Socrates is a real irritant, and he'll call himself a gadfly. A gadfly, it's like a um, little fly that stings a horse and leaves, kind of an uncomfortable mark. And Socrates says, "I am the gadfly of Athens. I am this irritant that is constantly questioning, constantly unsettling preconceived notion, and this is really where philosophy has to begin." So Socrates knows that he does not know, and his wisdom is based precisely on the recognition of his own limits. All right. So whether or not we agree that Socrates is the wisest, this is kind of his reputation, and this is where he sees himself in terms of philosophical argumentation. And in every dialogue we read, um, the conversations between him and his opponent or his friend, as it were, will often take the form, "What is X?" In other words, a topic will be proposed like the nature of justice or the nature of beauty. And Socrates will say, "Well, what is justice or what is beauty?" And it will often be uh, proposed different definitions that are pretty conventional and pretty ordinary and everyday. And Socrates will then chip away at those definitions and will say, "Well, hey, can justice really mean this? Actually, are we serious about that definition? Maybe there's a contradiction or something internally incoherent about that definition. And if we unpack it and sustain our belief, our disbelief about it, we can actually come to perhaps a higher understanding of the meaning." So Socrates, in the Apology, of course, famously has all these charges leveled against him by Miletus, the state prosecutor. And the big one is this idea that he's corrupting the youth, right? We talked about this a little bit. And this is his famous sort of reputation, or maybe like rebellious badge of honor, as it were, right? So Socrates famously has a circle of students, young men who are really inspired by him and his practice as a philosopher. But the city authorities are not at all pleased by this development, right? And they're not at all pleased by the phenomenon of Socrates as someone who is turning upside down the order of the city and the stability of the ideas that are meant to make the city work. So we have to think a little bit about whether or not he is corrupting the youth, because as I raised as a question last time, it's not obviously the case that he's not. It could be true that he's somehow corrupting them. If corruption is meant, if by corruption it is meant that he is filling them with dangerous ideas. It could be that being a philosopher is dangerous for the smooth functioning of society. It could be the case that actually it's not very healthy to question everything all the time. That is something that I want you to think about. Is it true, as Socrates puts it at the end of the text, that the unexamined life is not worth knowing, not worth living? He makes this very famous proclamation that we'll have to return to, that actually a life without self investigation and critical thinking is in fact a wasted life. Um, I think many people would actually be a little resistant to that idea, think that actually there is happiness in bliss and there is happiness in ignorance. Um, but it seems to me that Socrates' position as a philosopher and as a lover of wisdom um, is completely opposed to this idea of a lack of reflection and a lack of critical thought. All right. So I want to turn now to the main kind of confrontation between Socrates and Meletus in the piece. This is sort of the climax of the apology, really. This is where Socrates applies his method of skepticism to Meletus' own argument. And we will see, I think, that Socrates does a pretty good job of showing that Meletus can't possibly know what he is talking about when it comes to saying that Socrates corrupts the youth. All right. Um, I want you to think about the strategy that Socrates uses in unpacking and dismantling, ultimately, Meletus's train of thought. What he's really going to try to do is show that Meletus's definition of corruption is founded upon a contradiction, which means that it can't possibly logically be true. It is an invalid definition. All right. So let's just look at the text a little bit here, and I do want you to sort of flag it for yourself in the piece. And notice here in the dialogue, it can be a little bit hard to follow because um, this is a sort of a back and forth, right? It's a conversation between Socrates and Meletus at this point, and um, well, it's hard to follow who's who, but mostly Socrates is going to do most of the talking, and he is going to enlist, he's going to sort of enjoin Meletus to provide answers. And you will see that Socrates very cleverly sort of traps Meletus into an answer that isn't very good. All right, so this is really the crux of Socratic skepticism. Okay, so turn to the bottom with me of, yes, page 29 here. This is kind of where the rubber starts to hit the road, really, as it were. Socrates says, "You condemn me to a great misfortune." Let me try to use a highlighter here, maybe, so I can point this out here. Um, okay, yeah, right here. So you condemn me to a great misfortune. Tell me, does this also apply uh, to horses, do you think? That all men improve them and one individual corrupts them? Or quite the contrary, true? One individual is able to improve them, or very few, namely the horse breeders, whereas the majority, if they have horses and use them, corrupt them. Is that not the case, Meletus? Both with horses and other animals. I should just point out Socrates is in this kind of funny habit of creating comparisons or analogies with other professionals, things like horse breeders. Sometimes he'll talk about doctors and practitioners of medicine, and really he's just trying to construct an analogy, a comparison with another kind of practical action, right? So it can be a little sort of fuzzy what it is he's really talking about, all right? But he's talking about himself. It is whether you and Anytus say so or not. It would be a very happy state of affairs if only one person corrupted our youth, while the others improved them. You've made it sufficiently obvious, Meletus, that you've never had any concern for our youth. You show your indifference clearly, that you have given no thought to the subjects about which you bring me to trial. Ah, okay, so Socrates getting a little bit bold here. You have no idea what you're talking about, he's saying. And by Zeus, I should also say, you'll notice that this expression is coming up by Zeus. Zeus was the chief god of the ancient Athenian world, and that was a common expression to say by Zeus, right? It's kind of like saying, "Dear Lord," right? Meletus, tell us also whether it is better for a man to live among good or wicked fellow citizens. Answer, my good man, for I'm not asking a difficult question. Do not the wicked do some harm to those who are ever closest to them, whereas good people benefit them? And Meletus says, certainly. All right, so let's try to pause for a moment. What does that mean? That's kind of a question along the lines of, wouldn't you say that wicked people or evil people harm those around them and good people benefit those around them? Okay, so that's essentially the first premise. It's the first position that we are going to assume for the sake of argument is true. All right, so notice Socrates is building a logical argument with premises. Premises are statements that we are going to assume for the sake of the argument are true. And we will see what follows from those premises, all right, what actually logically unfolds in relation to those premises. All right, so the next little bit. And does the man exist who would rather be harmed than benefited by his associates? Answer, my good sir, for the law orders you to answer. Is there any man who wants to be harmed? Of course not. All right, so second premise. Is there anyone who wants to be harmed in the world? And Melinda says, no, there's not. Everyone wants to be improved. Everyone wants to be benefited. All right, so that would be a premise that now they can agree to. All right, so moving on. Come now, do you accuse me here of corrupting the youth and making them worse deliberately or unwillingly? And Melinda says, deliberately. This is really a premise about the intention of the action. So Meletus has to prove that Socrates is deliberately, that is, with a kind of premeditation, as it might be put today, corrupting people. He's not just doing so accidentally or by happenstance, right? He has intention and foresight in his corruption, right? Meletus is saying that the kind of corruption he's talking about is malevolent and comes with foresight. All right, so they've agreed to that. What follows, Meletus? Are you so much wiser at your age than I am at mine that you understand that wicked people always do some harm to their closest neighbors, while good people do them good? But I have reached such a pitch of ignorance that I do not realize this, namely, that if I make one of my associates wicked, I run the risk of being harmed by him, so that I do such a great evil deliberately, as you say. I do not believe you, Melendez, and I do not think anyone else will. Either I do not corrupt the young, or if I do, it is unwillingly, and you are lying in either case. Now, if I corrupt them unwillingly, the law does not require you to bring people to court for such unwilling wrongdoing, but to get hold of them privately, to instruct them and exhort them. For clearly, if I learn better, I shall cease to do what I am doing unwillingly. You, however, have avoided my company and were unwilling to instruct me, but you bring me here, where the law requires one to bring those who are in need of punishment, not of instruction. Now, there's a couple of things happening in this paragraph I want you to sort of be keyed into here. First is the use of what is called Socratic irony. Socrates is being very ironic. And irony is a rhetorical device that means that you are saying the exact opposite thing of what you intend. And he's doing this specifically when he refers to Meletus's wisdom, right? Socrates does not actually think Meletus is wise at all, right? He thinks he is trapped in prejudice and ignorance, but he's kind of calling him very wise, right? So Socrates will often do this with his opponents. He'll say, come on, you're so wise, tell me what the truth of justice is, right? And so clearly this is almost a kind of teasing. So there is a little bit of Socrates the bully here emerging as a practitioner of skepticism. All right, so Socratic irony is a very frequent sort of rhetorical device in his train of thinking. The rest of the paragraph is really an elaboration of this idea that Socrates must be, if he is guilty, it must be proven that he is doing so. He is corrupting the youth deliberately and with intent. All right. And so, men of Athens, what I say is clearly true. Meletus has never been at all concerned with these matters. Nonetheless, tell us, Meletus, how you say that I corrupt the young? Or is it obvious from your deposition that it is by teaching them not to believe in the gods in whom the city believes, but in other new spiritual things? Is this what you say I teach, and so corrupt them? That is most certainly what I do say. So Socrates is kind of asking, so what's this corruption about? Are you saying that I, in effect, am telling the young not to believe in the gods of the city, right? I.e., I'm teaching them some kind of religious sacrilege or some kind of atheism maybe, right? And Melendez says, yeah, that's pretty much what I'm saying. You're telling your students to disbelieve in the gods of the city, right? So that's sort of the next line of thinking here. Then by those very gods about whom we are talking, Meletus, make this clear to me and to these men. Cannot be sure whether you are concerned with things about none of which has never cared, and I shall try to prove that this is so. So come here and tell me, Meletus. Surely you consider it the greatest importance that our young men be as good as possible. Indeed, I do. Okay. Next premise, you agree that the task of teaching, in a way, the task of philosophy should be to improve these men, these students, right? So they've agreed to that. Come then, tell these men who improves them. You obviously know, in view of your concern. You say you've discovered the one who corrupts them, namely me, and you bring me here and accuse me to these men. Come, inform these men and tell them who it is who improves them. You see, Meletus, that you are silent and know not what you say. Does this seem shameful to you, and a sufficient proof of what I say, that you have not been concerned with any of this? Tell me, my good sir, who improves our young men? The laws. Okay, so Socrates says, what is it really that improves the men of the city? He says, the law of the city, is the source of political virtue, essentially. This is what is being established. So that is not what I'm asking, but what person who has knowledge of the laws to begin with? And he says, these jurymen. So Socrates says, wait, let's back up. It doesn't make sense to say it's the law that improves, but rather the author of the law. So who's that author? And Meletus essentially says the jury, the citizens of the city, are the author of the law. And how do you mean, Meletus? Are these able to educate the young and improve them? Certainly. Okay, so the authors of the law, the jury, have the capacity to improve and educate the young. All of them, or some, but not others? All of them. Okay, so all of the jury who represent the city of Athens have the capacity to improve the young through law. Very good, by Hera. You mentioned a great abundance of benefactors, but what about the audience? Did they improve the young or not? They do too. And what about the members of council, the councilors also? But Meletus, what about the assembly? Do members of the assembly corrupt the young, or do they improve them? They improve them. Okay, so we're listing other members of the city that are involved in this improvement through the authorship of the law, the councilors, and the members of the assembly, the ecclesia. But Meletus, all the Athenians, it seems, make the young into fine good men, except me, and I alone corrupt them. Is that what you mean? That is most definitely what I mean. Okay, so what has Socrates done here? He's pointing out something that, he's getting Meletus into a position that's becoming a little absurd, right? He's saying that literally everyone in the city improves the men of the city through being responsible for the laws that are written in the city. Literally everyone is doing a good job, basically, except for Socrates, who's this one source of corruption. Socrates isn't going to pursue this line of argumentation too much, but he is kind of dangling a bit of irony in front of the audience, because Socrates is, of course, part of this very society that has authored the law. So, by virtue of what difference, what origin would Socrates not belong to the very society that is producing these virtuous laws? It doesn't seem to be given as an explanation, right? And so he continues, you condemn me to a great misfortune. Tell me, does this also apply to horses, do you think? That all men improve them and one individual corrupts them? Or is quite the contrary true? One individual is able to improve them, or very few, namely the horse breeders, whereas the majority, if they have horses and use them, corrupt them. Is that not the case, Meletus? Both with horses and all other animals? Of course it is. Whoops. Whether you and Anytus say so or not. It would be a very happy state of affairs if only one person corrupted our youth, while the others improved them. So, what's he saying here? He's creating a disanalogy to show the lack of logic in Meletus's thinking. In other words, in the first case, it seems to be a majority of people that improve the youth, while a minority hurts them. But in the case of horse breeders, it's a minority of specialists, namely the horse breeders, that improve the object of their agency, the horse. So how can both be true? There seems to be a slippage between the majority as improver and the minority as corrupter, and the minority as improver and the majority as improver, a corrupter, right? So there's this kind of strange structural lack of consistency that Socrates is unpacking in a very, very formal way. So he says, you have made it sufficiently obvious, Meletus, that you've never had any concern for our youth. You show their indifference clearly, that you have given no thought to the subjects about which you bring to trial. Right. So Socrates is kind of, he believes he's proven his point. We'll have to think about, whether or not he really has. But he says, okay, you can't possibly know what you're talking about when you use this term corruption, because your argumentation is slippery. It's sliding all over the place. It's not consistent. It doesn't seem to really withstand the kind of skepticism, kind of scrutiny I'm bringing to bear on it, right? Uh, so he says, and Bysius Meletus, tell us also whether it is better for a man to live among good or wicked fellow citizens. Answer, my good man, for I'm not asking a difficult question. Do not the wicked do some harm to those who are closest to them, whereas good people benefit them? Certainly. Okay, so let's parse this premise. The good do good to those around them. Good people who are virtuous improve those around them. The wicked harm those around them. All right, so that seems like a straightforward premise that can be agreed to. Let us agrees to it. And does the man exist who would rather be harmed than benefited by his associates? Answer, my good sir, if the law orders you to answer. Is there any man who wants to be harmed? Of course not. Right? Second premise of this part of the argument. No one exists who wants to be harmed. There is no such thing as a person who wants harm. Um, Notice this one's a little slippery. It may not be true, actually. There might be people out there who want to be harmed. But Socrates has trapped Meletus now. He's gotten him to agree to a premise which holds that there is no such thing as a man who wants to be harmed. All right, so pay close attention. This is where the contradiction in the argument is going to emerge from. So come now, do you accuse me here of corrupting the young and making them worse deliberately or unwillingly? Deliberately. All right, so this is just a repetition of the idea that Socrates' corruption is intentional, comes with foresight. So what follows, Meletus? Are you so much wiser at your age than I am at mine that you understand that wicked people always do some harm to their closest neighbors while good people do them good? But I've reached such a pitch of ignorance that I do not realize this, namely, that if I make one of my associates wicked, I run the risk of being harmed by him, so that I do such a great evil deliberately, as you say. I do not believe you, Meletus, and I do not think anyone else will. Either I do not corrupt the young, or if I do, it is unwillingly. You are lying in either case. Now, if I corrupt them unwillingly, the law does not require you to bring people to court for such unwilling wrongdoings, but to get hold of them privately to instruct them and exhort them. Okay. Um, so, what's the argument here? Just to get into the details and to kind of parse it out a little bit, we have this claim: evil people or wicked people harm those around them. Right? That's the first premise. And that seems to be pretty agreeable or pretty much true. Like, you know, it seems to be in the nature of the evil to damage those and like drag them down and fill them with toxic ideas, right? So that seems okay. The second premise, if I corrupt the youth, I'm either doing it intentionally or unintentionally. If I corrupt the youth intentionally, then I must want to be harmed, right? So think about this. How is this following from the previous premises? It's following because we've agreed that the wicked harm those around them. And in doing so, they're kind of increasing the likelihood that they too will be harmed, right? Because to be associated with the wicked and the toxic and the evil is to damage oneself. So it's kind of like saying, well, if I'm corrupting the youth, I must be a self harming type of guy because that's really the only thing that follows from corruption is to pollute the water, as it were. And if I'm doing that with intent, I must sort of have some desire to be damaged. But the problem is, as we've agreed from the previous premise, there is no such thing as a person who wants to be harmed. Is there any man who wants to be harmed? Of course not, right? Socrates has trapped Meletus here in a contradiction in which he's saying two things at the same time. He is saying that uh, Socrates' behavior seems to have the trait of deliberately harming those in a manner that will harm himself. But he has also said that no one wants harm. So how can both things be true? Right? They can't be. Therefore, if I corrupt the young, I do not do it intentionally. So Socrates is sort of providing a caveat here and saying, well, maybe there is some harm that has come about from my practice, but it can't be with the kind of intention and foresight that you're saying, because that would mean I'm the type of person who wants to escalate the risk of my own harm. And we've agreed that there is no such person, right? So Socrates kind of concludes, if I've corrupted the youth, I've only done so unintentionally, and therefore my harm is not the kind of evil you're talking about, and is certainly not worthy of the punishment that you're bringing forth, right? Um, so Socrates believes he has kind of trapped Meletus in a real chink in his armor, that his argument has sort of degenerated by pointing to in Greek what's called melenchus, or a kind of point of contradiction or nonsense in the argument. Um, and it's a sort of a complex maneuver he's done here through these cycles of dialogue. So I want you to read over them again and really make sure you understand how Socrates has sort of trapped Meletus here. Um, Now, the atheism stuff it is given a little bit less attention to in the piece. I'll just simply point out that Socrates will point to the existence of what is called a daimon, a spirit guardian that he listens to. And this is another aspect of the ancient Greek mythos that is sort of coloring the piece. And Socrates simply says, look, daimon is the child of the gods, and I listen to a child of the gods. So if I'm doing that, I can't really be an atheist. I seem to practice divine rituals, and I seem to belong. I've done the stuff with the Oracle of Delphi. How plausible is it really that I'm just an absolute disbeliever in the gods? So I don't know. I don't really find Socrates' arguments about that stuff here too strong, simply for the reason that, as I pointed out, he is skeptical in his relationship to the Word of God, specifically with the Oracle of Delphi. So that's a question that we can talk about further, and I think we'll see he has a little bit richer version of the afterlife and God in the Phaedo and the allegory of the cave. Other pieces we'll explore together. But suffice it to say, for the moment, he believes that there isn't enough proof that he's an atheist to warrant the death penalty, right? So he'll refer to spiritual activities and the activities of his spirit guardian. And so if he's sort of plugged into those spiritual activities, it can't really be proof that he's an atheist. Now, notice it's kind of a hard thing to have to prove in trial that you believe in God, right? We wouldn't, really hold someone up for such a crime today, and so this is a very different world, of course, with a different worldview and a different relationship between the rule of God and the rule of the state of the people, and there's less of this idea of separation of church and state, right? In fact, there's meant to be a tight unity of the divine and the law in ancient Athens. And so, actually, in a way, it's worth remarking on the fact that Socrates's position here is almost impossible, right? Even though he provides a lot of good arguments, the game is a bit rigged against him, right? It doesn't seem like there's some proof that he could really bring forth. So what is he gonna do? Is there some video of him talking to God? Of course not. Is there evidence that he believes? Well, what would count as evidence? Other than these interactions with the Oracle of Delphi, uh, one can only really take him at his word, right? Um, I don't think Socrates does reject the gods. Actually, I think he is a believer in the gods of the city. If you look closely, and I think more evidence of this will unfold as we come to know him a little bit better. But I do think this is still a question whether or not he's corrupting the youth. It depends on how we define the term corruption, right? Um, if corruption means harm the youth, damage them, yeah, probably he's innocent. But if corruption means teaching them stuff that is a little bit volatile or a little bit dangerous to the rule of the city, maybe he is guilty actually on some bare level. So I think I want you to just sustain this as a question as we continue to read the dialogues, whether or not Socrates' conception of a philosophical life and philosophical wisdom does come with this risk of, if not corruption, at least some kind of rebellion, some kind of political hostility to the prevailing order of the day, of the status quo, let's say, right? All right. Um, that is pretty much the main set of arguments in the apology. I just want to look to the end of the text before we finish up here. There's a few lingering things to look at. You will notice in the dialogue that despite Socrates' excellent job of making his apology, making his defense, he does not win, right? The jury votes against him, and he gets the verdict of guilty, sadly. And the penalty is death. Socrates will have to drink this hemlock poison that kills him. And we'll have to read the whole dialogue called the Phaedo that will think a lot more about what death means. But in this piece, we get the impression that Socrates could have gotten out of this jam if he had just sort of copped to the things that he was being accused of corruption and maybe atheism, and said he was sorry and he would have walked away. Um, there's good evidence to believe that is the situation here. But Socrates didn't want to do that. I think he felt that that would be a betrayal of his philosophical and ethical commitments. And those commitments really do come to a head here towards the end of the Apology on page 41 in this paragraph, where I think he kind of distills his commitment as a thinker, a free thinker, and a practitioner of skepticism. So just to read along here. Perhaps someone might say, but Socrates, if you leave us, will you not be able to live quietly without talking? Now, this is the most difficult point in which to convince some of you. If I say that it is impossible for me to keep quiet, because that means disobeying the god, you will not believe me and will think I'm being ironical. On the other hand, if I say that it is the greatest good for man to discuss virtue every day, and those other things about which you hear me conversing and testing myself and others, for the unexamined life is not worth living for men, you will believe me even less. So I want you to think about that on your own. The unexamined life is not worth living. And he kind of says the best kind of life is the life that he has led. That is, every day get into an argument about a big idea. What is virtue? What is justice? What is beauty? What is the good life? And hash it out, have an argument, and try to come to some independent conclusions about those things. And Socrates is saying, by implication, if you don't do that, you've wasted your life. You've taken for granted truths that you should not have taken for granted, and often an unhappy life will emerge from simply going through the motions and kind of falling into a sort of automatic pilot where you do what other people tell you to do. And I want you to think about for yourself whether or not Socrates is true about that. Is it correct to say that an unexamined life is not worth living? Or is there a virtue in not skeptically challenging everything? Because actually, after all, it is pretty exhausting and troublesome, as you can see, for Socrates to constantly criticize and challenge everything. So is there a limit to this conception of a good life, right? Um, this kind of is going to conclude things for us for the apology. You'll notice right here on the same page, Socrates does get the death penalty. So this is pretty serious stuff. And the rest of the trial of death of Socrates will unpack further elements as he faces his final hour, really, in the Phaedo, where he will have to face his death. Um, so for the next reading, I want you to look at the most famous piece in all of Plato's philosophy, arguably all of philosophy, in the history of the West. And it's a small dialogue from another moment in another book called The Republic, called The Allegory of the Cave. Right? It's one small section of the Allegory of the Cave, and I will provide that readings for you. And we will consider it together in the next video. Okay, so feel free to reach out if you have questions. I encourage you to look over some of the major ideas in the Apology again. Specifically, the main takeaways are the idea of Socratic wisdom, the method of skepticism, of critically investigating opinion. I want you to look at the details of the argument between him and Miletus again and try to parse out how Socrates traps Miletus in a position that is contradictory. And then again, I want you to think about this idea of the highest kind of life that Socrates says, a philosophical life. All right. So those are the main takeaways of the Apology. All right. Thank you, everyone. Stay in touch with me and continue to keep up with the readings. I will make them available for you on Blackboard. Thank you.